I'm Arnel Casanova. I'm a lawyer by chance. I'm the executive director of Asia Society here in the Philippines. Thank you for the insights that you've shared with us for all the panelists. But I think I was actually looking for one thing which I think was missing in the discussion. Is because I think most of the economists now are looking at the future of the Philippine economy as still based on the exploitation of natural resources. I think that's still important. But I was actually looking more at how the human resource of the Philippines would be further improved, at where we could actually create more entrepreneurs and create more innovation that would drive the knowledge economy of the Philippines. Rather than, because for decades actually, even for the time of the Americans, even up to now, our natural resources had actually been exploited. In fact, we don't even have much now. Our forests are now one of the most depleted in the world. If those resources were actually used for the Philippine economy, we could have actually improved. But what happened there? That's a very big question. We see our agricultural lands being converted into industrial and even residential lands, and still we are economically lagging. So what happened there again? But I'm more particularly interested in how our policymakers had looked at the Filipinos not simply as labor providers, but actually entrepreneurs and innovators. Because if we look at small countries like Taiwan and Singapore, there are a lot of more investments in technology. And also one thing that perhaps need to be said is that most of our companies, our big businesses here, are quite insular in thinking. I haven't seen Filipino global companies really compete with the biggest businesses in the world.
Would you like to address your question to a specific member of the panel?
Yeah, so I would like to ask whether there had been studies, in the future of Philippines, because we are 95 million Filipinos and growing, instead of looking at our population as liability, would rather look optimistically and invest more in the development of that human resource. Would that actually propel the country in the world economy?
Okay, I'm actually, I don't think you can generalize from country to country, but if you look at the Southeast Asian countries and the East Asian countries in the last 30 years, yes, there was one silver bullet or magic bullet or whatever for economic development, which was labor-intensive export manufacturing. And particularly by multinationals, because multinationals gave you access to global markets, access to technology, access to brand names that you didn't have. So that essentially is what happened in the regional, export processing zones and all that. But that's probably the only commonality. Beyond that, how do you move from that phase of labor-intensive export manufacturing? In the case of the Philippines, that never really took off. They started and then they never actually got to scale and move beyond. And there's a difference between the Korea, Taiwan, on the one hand, and how they did it. They did it by having this as an adjunct to Korea and Taiwan created local companies that became global champions, right? They did this. Malaysia and Singapore did not. Okay, so Malaysia and Singapore did not have local entrepreneurs that did this, and they remained very dependent on multinationals. So, but both sets of countries had very rapid growth, and actually, if you look at so the Philippines is very different from them. In other countries, local entrepreneurs are actually discouraged, and multinationals are favored. One might include, besides Malaysia and Singapore, possibly China in that category, because local entrepreneurs pose a political threat to the state. Okay, so the relationship between multinationals and the state and domestic entrepreneurs is very complex and evolves over time. In the case of Singapore, they have for 20 years been lamenting the fact that they don't have domestic entrepreneurs. So then they set up entrepreneurship committees and incentives, and the incredible entrepreneurs are not created by committee. They are not created by government policy. They are not created by university entrepreneurial studies programs. They're not created by subsidies. I mean, people just don't understand. Okay, so and in the end, you figure out why are Singaporeans not entrepreneurs. Filipinos are much more entrepreneurial. Okay, Filipinos at all levels. And I remember the old days. Sorry, I know this is not a popular subject. When we first had Filipino maids, okay, in Singapore. Everyone was so shocked because on their day off, they would start trading in the parks. They would all go to the parks and start exchanging goods. And like Singaporeans, like, we don't do that. We can only be salaried workers. We can only be wage workers, okay? And you have to look in each case why that happens. So I don't think that entrepreneurs can create it. I think that governments should remove and they shouldn't favor particular domestic industries entrepreneurs. They should remove the barriers to business creation and business enterprise, regardless of who the entrepreneur is. They shouldn't favor foreign entrepreneurs. They shouldn't favor domestic entrepreneurs. This is a set of conditions that you have, and this is who, let people make it. So there are lots of theories about why we don't have, why some countries become very dependent on multinationals. I understand the discussion here, which is that Philippines missed the boat of using multinationals to leverage and grow their domestic industry, their skills and talent. They missed that boat. Okay, so the question is that boat still, is there another boat sort of there? No, because these things are historical. And the other thing on geography, one reason why I stopped coming here is from the stuff that I studied. Multinationals and even non-multinationals, Asian firms like say Acer or the Samsung, whatever, they developed vertically integrated regional supply chains for global markets, and the Philippines was out of it, right? So I remember coming here in '96 and meeting, President Marcos. Not Marcos, no, not Marcos, Ramos. And Ramos said to me at that time, he said, can you get General Motors to invest here? And General Motors, which is from the state of Michigan, that's why he saw us, my group, was choosing between Thailand and the Philippines. Okay, they were choosing between those two. And the Philippines doesn't have a concept of clusters, okay, which is how modern industry operates. And Ramos said, can you tell General Motors to set up here? I said, no, I can't tell them, although I have students in there. But it was a very interesting exercise that General Motors did. They chose Thailand. And they chose Thailand because Thailand could provide the supply chain of local entrepreneurs. Autos has like lots of parts, right? So there were entrepreneurs to produce all those local parts. But Thailand was not their first choice. This is '96. Their first choice was Singapore, where there's no people, no market, and no technology. And why was their first choice Singapore? And Singapore said, no, we have no people, no market, etc. Why do we want you? Because it turns out that the big factor, and this applies to the Philippines today, the big factor when you have a supply chain that extends across many countries is getting your stuff in and out of the port, right? Because you cannot, a small country cannot, small economies cannot produce everything. You cannot produce the whole automotive supply chain. And it turns out that the shortness of time, turning around a container in an hour, is what makes a difference. You cannot have your parts sit there for 3 days or 3 weeks until the customs decides, I will let you go. So, no, I mean, it's serious. But the point is that business, you have to think about very different types of models. You have to plug yourself into a regional or global supply chain. What the Philippines did was they had so-called free trade zone, export processing zone. I remember driving to Bataan, export processing zone way back in the 80s. So why is the zone there? You know, it was like 2 hours on some bumpy road. It's like ridiculous. You know, why is the road there? And I was told, I told there was some land owners, whatever, might have had interest in that. But I was visiting these export zones in all the other countries at that time, and they were just in, out, in, out. Because when you tie up your parts, you're tying up, you know, for time, you're tying up capital. There's an interest cost of that capital. So in a world of just-in-time, no inventory, etc., you have to be really efficient, and the infrastructure, both the internal infrastructure and the external infrastructure, becomes very, very important. That is the part that I think the Philippines, I've talked too long, so I'll stop that. That is one of the big inhibitors, not just to miss the boat, but during the time of missing the boat, never created the conditions that enable, I don't care if it's a foreigner or a local, to bring these parts in and out, because there's no longer a Philippine national supply chain. It's regional and it's global, and that's the problem.